hadn't seen Aunt Dolores in years. In fact, most of us only remembered her during big events like weddings or funerals, and even then, she always seemed distant. So when she sent out invitations for us to spend Christmas at her house, it caught everyone by surprise. My mom even said, "Why now, after all this time?" But in the end, everyone decided to go. It seemed like a good chance to bring the family closer together, and honestly, it was kind of exciting to think about. We arrived at her house on the night of the 24th. The house was large and beautifully decorated, and Aunt Dolores greeted us with a big smile. She had taken care of absolutely everything. The decorations were perfect, with a huge Christmas tree and lights glowing in every corner. The smell of the food was mouth-watering. The night started out great, at least at first. Aunt Dolores seemed happy, almost emotional to see everyone together. She poured drinks for everyone, made sure our plates were full, and even told a few funny stories that had the room filled with laughter. When dinner was served, people couldn't get enough of the food. And I can't lie, it was delicious. The turkey was perfect, the side dishes were all the Christmas classics, and everyone was raving about it. My mom even said, "Dolores, you outdid yourself. This is wonderful." Aunt Dolores just smiled. A tight smile, but no one thought much of it. What none of us knew was that, within a few hours, that night would turn into a complete nightmare. It was around midnight when things started to get strange. My aunt, who had been so lively and cheerful just moments before, got up from the table, saying she didn't feel well. She looked pale and was sweating heavily, and we thought maybe it was just the heat or exhaustion. But then other people started complaining about stomach pains and dizziness. First, it was my Uncle Carl, then my cousin Anna, and within minutes, it seemed like half the family was feeling sick. The room, once full of laughter, turned heavy with tension. Some people rushed to the bathroom to throw up, others lay on the couch groaning. I started to feel a strange taste in my mouth and a wave of nausea, and that's when I realized something was terribly wrong. It was my mom who suggested we head to the hospital after my grandmother passed out in her armchair. Everything became chaotic. Family members split up into cars, trying to get everyone there as quickly as possible. I sat in the back seat with my dad driving while my mom tried to calm my sister, who was crying uncontrollably. When we got to the hospital, the doctors were already on alert because there were so many of us, and the symptoms were the same: poisoning. The word made my blood run cold. Poisoning? The doctor started asking questions about what we had eaten and drank, and slowly it all started to click. The problem was the food. The dinner Aunt Dolores had so carefully prepared was the cause of all this. While we were at the hospital, things became clearer and more terrifying. The doctors confirmed that the poisoning wasn't accidental. They found traces of a toxic substance mixed into the food. No one could believe it. Who would do this to their own family? My mom whispered, almost in shock. The police were called, and by then, the tension had turned into panic. I looked around at my relatives lying on the floor, hooked up to IVs, receiving treatment, and I couldn't stop thinking about Aunt Dolores. That image of her smiling during dinner started to feel eerie and distorted. How could someone who seemed so calm and happy have planned something so cruel? The next day, the police went to her house and brought her in for questioning. That's when the truth came out. Aunt Dolores confessed. She admitted that she had poisoned the food on purpose because she was tired of being ignored, of being the distant aunt no one remembered or cared about. They only come out of obligation, never because they actually want to see me, she reportedly told the officers. The news spread through the family like an earthquake. Some people were furious, others were in disbelief, and my grandmother, who had recovered by then, couldn't stop crying. I felt empty. It was as if the night that started with so much joy had been a lie. And maybe it was. Aunt Dolores never really seemed truly happy. Only now did I realize that her smile during dinner had a hint of bitterness. The days that followed were strange, like the whole family was trying to wake up from a nightmare. Aunt Dolores was arrested, and no one really knew what to feel. Some called her a monster, while others just shook their heads, repeating that it didn't make sense. I couldn't stop thinking about her words. It was true that no one paid much attention to her. I barely saw her myself and hardly remembered the sound of her voice or her stories. But to justify something so extreme, to try to poison her own family as revenge, the thought made me sick all over again, like the poison was still lingering inside me. Aunt Dolores's house was left empty after that, as if it had been cursed. No one wanted to talk about that night during family gatherings. It was like we had collectively erased it from our memories, even though we all knew we'd never forget it. To this day, whenever Christmas approaches, I think about how normal her smile looked and how I never paid attention to who she really was. Maybe the biggest mistake was ignoring the signs she had been giving her whole life. I'll never excuse what she did, but one thing is certain. That night taught me that bitterness, when left to grow, can turn anyone into something you'd never imagine. I never used to celebrate Christmas, you know? I always spent the holiday alone, watching something on TV or going to bed early just to pretend it wasn't a big deal. Last year, my friend Luke, who works with me, found out about my tradition and insisted I spend Christmas with his family. "It'll be fun, man, you'll see. My family's great," he said. The idea felt strange, but he pushed so hard that I finally agreed. I showed up at his place on the afternoon of the 24th. A big, well-kept house with that classic family vibe. Twinkling Christmas lights, the smell of food coming from the kitchen, kids running around the yard. First, I felt really welcomed. Everyone was friendly, asking about my life, offering me food. It seemed like I was finally going to have a normal Christmas. But as the hours passed, I started to notice something off. I don't even know how to explain it, but it was like everyone there was a little suspicious of me. The conversations, which had been relaxed and cheerful, turned strange. I could see side glances and hear whispers that stopped the moment I got close. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. After all, I was the outsider, the stranger in their family gathering. But after a while, it became clear it wasn't just in my head. While Luke got distracted playing video games with his cousins, I decided to go to the bathroom. But in the hallway, I accidentally opened the wrong door. What I saw froze me in place. It was a small room, completely packed with bags, boxes, and packages, all filled with drugs. It looked like some kind of secret stash. At that moment, it felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I slowly closed the door, trying not to make a sound, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to do. If I should go back to the living room and pretend nothing happened or try to sneak out of there. Before I could decide, I heard a voice behind me. "What are you doing here?" someone said, cold and direct. I turned around and found one of Luke's uncles standing there, a big guy with a stern expression. He didn't wait for me to answer. He grabbed my arm roughly and dragged me back into the room with the drugs. "You saw what you shouldn't have, didn't you?" he growled, locking the door behind us. In that moment, I knew I was screwed. I tried to say I hadn't seen anything, that I wouldn't tell anyone, but he didn't let me finish. He shoved me into an old chair in the corner of the room and walked out, locking the door behind him. I could hear him calling someone, telling them, "We've got a problem." I froze. They knew I'd found out everything, and now they were probably deciding what to do with me. My mind was racing. Were they going to threaten me? Hurt me? Kill me? Time passed, and I could hear them arguing on the other side of the door. Several voices, all talking at once, their tone getting louder and more agitated. No one used my name, they only referred to me as him, like I was a problem that needed to be solved. Time felt frozen in that room. I was sweating and trying to stay calm, but all I could think was that I wasn't getting out of there. The door was locked, the window had bars on the outside, and the argument outside just kept going. At one point, I heard someone yell, "We can't let him leave here." Panic hit me like a wave. I started scanning the room, looking for anything that could help me, but there was nothing except the boxes and bags. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint sound behind me. When I turned, I saw a child, a boy, about 7 or 8 years old, huddled in the corner, watching me the whole time. He was probably someone's kid from the family, and he looked scared but didn't say a word. I whispered, "Hey, can you unlock this door for me?" The boy stared at me for a few seconds, then nodded. He got up slowly, walked to the door, and slipped a small key into the lock. The door clicked open, and I could hardly believe it. "Please don't tell anyone," I said. He just looked at me seriously, like he understood exactly what was happening. Before he could change his mind, I slipped out of the room as quickly as I could, trying not to make a sound. The house was silent. Everyone was probably still in the kitchen arguing. I seized the opportunity and crept to the front door. Every step felt like it took an eternity. When I finally got there, I realized the door was locked. That's when I heard footsteps coming toward me. My heart raced. The footsteps were getting closer, and I knew I didn't have time to look for a key. I looked around desperately until I spotted a window in the living room that was slightly open. I didn't think twice. I ran over and started pulling it open with all my strength. The noise made someone shout behind me, "He's trying to get out." That was all the adrenaline I needed. I pushed the window as far as it would go, and even though it didn't open completely, I managed to squeeze through. I scraped myself on the way out, cutting my arm on a rusty nail, but I didn't stop. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I ran like my life depended on it, because honestly, I think it did. I could still hear shouting and footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I sprinted down the empty street, not even knowing where I was going. The Christmas lights decorating the other houses felt ironic, like they were mocking me. After a few minutes of running, I found a main road and saw a car coming. I jumped in front of it, waving my arms frantically, and the driver slammed on the brakes. It was an older man who rolled down the window and started yelling at me, but I begged him for help, saying someone was trying to kill me. I think he saw how desperate I was because he told me to get in. As soon as I sat in the passenger seat, I started shaking. The man asked what happened, but I couldn't answer. My mind was stuck on one thought. If that boy hadn't helped me, I wouldn't be alive to tell this story. As the car drove away, I looked out the window and saw, in the distance, the silhouettes of several people standing in front of the house. They were looking for me, I was sure of it. My heart didn't start to slow down until we reached a busy road and the man dropped me off at a nearby police station. I stumbled in, out of breath and sweating, and told the officers everything. They looked at me like I was crazy, but after I described the house and where it was, they went to investigate. I don't know exactly what happened after that because I left before they came back with answers. I just wanted to disappear and get as far away from that nightmare as possible. In the days that followed, Luke texted me as if nothing had happened. He asked why I left without saying anything, but he wouldn't answer when I asked about his family. After a while, he stopped reaching out, and I never had the courage to ask about that night again. To this day, I don't know what happened to those people or if anyone got arrested. The only thing I know is that every time Christmas comes around, I think about that look on the boy's face when he helped me. It was the look of someone who, even at such a young age, knew exactly the kind of family he lived in. I don't know his name, I never asked, but if it weren't for him, I might not be here telling this story. I'll never forget Christmas Eve of 2021. It was supposed to be one of those typical family gatherings filled with food, laughter, and that one uncle who always drinks too much wine. The house was full. The smell of the turkey roasting in the oven filled the air, and everyone was talking loudly in the living room. I remember looking at my mom and seeing that smile she only gives when she's truly happy. Up until that point, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My cousin Daniel, who had come from another city, was sitting in a corner, glued to his phone, unusually quiet. It wasn't exactly strange, he'd always been the reserved type, but looking back, there was something about him that gave me chills, though I couldn't explain why. Everything fell apart around 10:30 p.m. when someone knocked on the door. It was a firm, heavy knock. My dad even joked, "Santa Claus is late this year." I was closest to the door, so I went to answer it. When I opened it, I was face to face with two police officers. Tall, serious men with that hardened, unreadable look. "Good evening. We're looking for Daniel Smith. Is he here?" One of them asked directly. My heart froze on the spot. I called for my dad, unsure what to do, and that's when everyone in the house noticed the strange tension. My uncle, Daniel's dad, stood up, pale, and asked what was going on. The officer simply replied, "We need to speak with him. It's urgent." No one knew what to say. The room, which had been noisy and cheerful just moments ago, fell completely silent. My uncle started looking around at everyone, like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of mistake. "Daniel, come here, son," he called, and my cousin walked over slowly, like he knew what was coming. The police officers asked him to come with them to the car, and Daniel didn't ask a single question. He just looked at us, gave a forced smile, like he was trying to calm everyone, and walked out. No one moved. We all stood frozen, like what had just happened couldn't be real. My grandmother started mumbling something about it being Christmas and how none of this made any sense. After the door closed and the police took Daniel away, shock settled over the room. My uncle was the first to break the silence. "This has to be a mistake. It has to be." My mom tried to comfort my grandmother, but she was visibly shaken too. My dad, who always tried to stay calm, had a serious expression and paced back and forth. Someone suggested calling the police station, but no one really knew what was happening. "There's no way Daniel could be involved in anything," my uncle kept repeating, as if trying to convince himself. All I could think about was the empty look in my cousin's eyes before he walked out the door. A look that, now I realize, was full of guilt and resignation. The tension in the room grew unbearable. About 20 minutes later, my uncle got a phone call. He answered it on speaker, his hands shaking, and the voice on the other end was from someone at the police station. The news hit us like a bomb. Daniel had been wanted for 3 days for a brutal crime in the city where he lived. They didn't give many details, but said it involved a murder. Murder. The word echoed in the room like a hammer blow. My aunt collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. My grandmother started praying softly while my dad turned off the TV, which was still playing cheerful Christmas music as if nothing had happened. I didn't know what to think. Daniel, my cousin, who had grown up with me, who came to our house every Christmas, accused of killing someone? I thought back to all the summers we spent together as kids, playing in the yard, Sunday lunches with the family. None of it made sense. My mind was racing, trying to fit this into some kind of logic that just didn't exist. The more I thought about it, the more odd things came to mind. He had always been quiet, sure, but I started remembering how, in recent years, he had grown more distant, avoided talking about his life, and how sometimes I'd catch him watching people with that cold, far-away look I never could explain. After the phone call ended, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. No one could look anyone else in the eye. My uncle ran out to the police station, and my aunt locked herself in a bedroom, crying while my mom tried to console her. The rest of us just sat there in the living room, unsure what to do or say. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where Daniel had been sitting earlier, and I started to feel sick. You know that chill that creeps up your spine? It was like the air had turned heavy. Suddenly, I noticed small details that I hadn't before. His backpack was still sitting in the corner of the room. It looked too full, way too heavy for someone who had just come for Christmas. Out of curiosity, or maybe just nerves, I walked over to the backpack. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to look. As soon as I unzipped it, my heart nearly stopped. Inside, there was a mess of dirty clothes and, buried among them, a pair of leather gloves stained with something that looked like dried blood. I froze. My whole body went cold. I zipped the backpack shut immediately and went back to the couch, trying to act normal, but my mind was spinning. I thought about telling someone, but what would I even say? That I found stained gloves in Daniel's backpack, as if that were definitive proof of anything? I just wanted to erase that image from my mind. Time seemed to crawl. Every second in that living room felt like an eternity. Outside, the sound of the police cars had faded, but inside me, the knock on the door still echoed, over and over again. My aunt came back out of the bedroom looking calmer, but her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She glanced at Daniel's backpack for a second, and I thought she was going to ask about it, but she looked away, like she couldn't deal with what was happening. I sat there quietly, wondering if anyone else in the family had ever noticed something strange about Daniel before tonight. How could someone we'd known our whole lives be capable of something so brutal? Around midnight, my uncle came back from the station. His face said it all. He walked in, tossed his keys onto the table, and just said, There's no going back. He confessed. Confessed. That word hit like another bomb. My stomach turned. No one said a word. We just listened as my uncle explained, his voice shaking, that Daniel had killed a neighbor in a fit of rage. Apparently, they'd had a bad argument weeks earlier, and that night, something inside him just snapped. The crime scene had been too violent to dismiss as a momentary impulse. The police had found the body in the neighbor's yard and traced Daniel back to our town. After Daniel's confession, no one could stay in the same room. My grandmother locked herself in her room. My mom sat in the kitchen staring at nothing, and my dad kept muttering that it was unbelievable. Me? Couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything that had happened that night. It wasn't just the shock of the crime. It was the fact that someone I had known my entire life, someone who seemed so normal, could do something so monstrous. How did we never notice? How could he sit there, eat Christmas dinner with us, knowing what he had done? The worst part was realizing I had been so close to him, talking to him without suspecting a thing. It was like he had been a stranger the whole time, and we had never seen it. The next day, my aunt packed up Daniel's things and handed his backpack to the police. The stained gloves were still inside. After that, the subject became taboo in the family. No one talks about that night anymore, as if ignoring it will make it disappear. But to this day, every Christmas, when the family gets together, I wait for someone to knock on the door. Even though I know it's irrational, I still get a chill every time the doorbell rings. It's like that night never really ended. And maybe it never will, because the worst part is that I'll never understand how someone so close could hide something so dark.